Democritus. The modern word for atom comes from his idea of atomos. Who was he? He was a philosopher who studied under Leucippus. He lived to a ripe old age of 90, which was pretty rare back then, in 460 to 370 BCE. He's credited with Leucippus, but mostly Democritus gets credit for the first idea of the atom. He thought that the characteristics of an object were determined by the shape of the atoms that made up that object, and we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. Atomos. So the idea that he and Leucippus had was that there has to be a lowest divisible unit of matter. There has to be a building block. There are two schools of thought. Either you can keep on dividing matter forever and ever and ever, or you can divide it down to its smallest individual parts, and that's what it is made out of. If you can think about it, the thought experiment, if you cut a piece of paper in half with scissors, then you grab one of those halves and cut that in half. There's going to be a certain point where you cannot cut that half of a half of a half in half anymore. There's got to be a limitation as to how far you can break something down. In other words, how can we use another object to separate other objects if it's not down to its smallest individual part? So tomos means cuttable or divisible, and atomos means uncuttable or indivisible. And that's where we get the idea and or word for atom. He thought that the shape led to the characteristics. For instance, a bar or sample of iron metal was comprised of iron atoms, and the iron atoms have the same sort of properties that the iron does. He thought that the iron atoms were linked together in hooks, which allowed them to bend, but they had a rigid and solid structure. Clay was made out of clay atoms, and that they were soft and smooth, and they had ball and socket joints, much like your arm fits into your shoulder, because clay is easily moldable and movable, and these atoms must be able to move freely. Conversely, he had an idea for sweet foods must be made out of smooth atoms because their smoothness meant that it tasted sweeter on the way down, and bitter foods must be sharp because they're pointed and sharp as they injure your mouth. Some reasons why Democritus's idea of the atom was largely forgotten for over 2,000 years, and it wasn't until the modern chemistry was first revived did the idea of the atom come back, is because Democritus's idea of all matter in the universe flew in the face of Aristotle's idea of what all matter was comprised of in the universe. Socrates was the teacher of Plato. Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle was the mentor of a very famous emperor, Alexander the Great. Because of all their other contributions, and how famous they were, their ideas for what the universe and matter was made out of had more weight to it than what Democritus's bold view of an individual, indivisible unit of matter. For Aristotle, things like that ceramic bowl that he had for his plate or bowl was made up of a combination of the elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Specifically, ceramic would be made out of earth, fire, and water, because you take dirt and water and make moldable clay, you shape it into a bowl shape and fire it in a kiln, and the fire mixes with the earth and the water and makes a ceramic hard bowl. We now know that that is definitely not what it takes or what all matter is comprised of, but we still use the word elements when we talk about our periodic table of elements.